History remembers Abraham Lincoln in marble, a tall man in stillness, a face carved into stone, a voice frozen into quotations. But marble hides the violence of his journey. Before he became a monument, he was a boy in a one-room cabin on the Kentucky frontier. Before he preserved the Union, he learned how fragile a home could be. Before he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he watched death, poverty, hunger, and labor press against a family with no protection from the world. And before he spoke of freedom to a wounded nation, he helped build his own life out of loss, discipline, and endurance. This is what makes Lincoln different from so many powerful men in history. He was not born near power. He was not educated inside institutions of privilege. He did not inherit connections, polish, or certainty. He entered the world with almost nothing except work in front of him and wilderness around him. The great paradox of Lincoln's life is that the man who would one day hold together a collapsing republic first learned survival, where law was thin, comfort was scarce, and every advantage had to be earned the hard way. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in Hardin County, Kentucky, in humble frontier surroundings. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was practical, hard-working, and shaped by physical labor. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a guiding moral force in his early life. Lincoln himself later described his family as coming from undistinguished families, which is exactly what makes the story so explosive. There was no script pointing this child toward the White House. There was only land to clear, wood to split, and a brutal world that did not care whether he rose or disappeared. The frontier boy. When Lincoln was still a child, the family moved from Kentucky to southern Indiana. He later recalled it as a wild region, full of rough conditions and danger. This matters because Lincoln's early life was not romantic poverty. It was frontier poverty. It meant cold mornings, relentless chores, unfinished roads, primitive shelter, and a daily contest against nature. The mythology of the log cabin often softens this reality. In truth, the frontier was a machine that broke many people. Lincoln survived it, but more importantly, he studied it. He watched how pressure changed people. He saw how weakness could become bitterness, how hardship could either harden the spirit or deepen it. He worked constantly. Young Abraham helped his father carve a life out of the wilderness. He learned the plow, the axe, and the rhythm of labor that begins before the body is ready and ends after it is exhausted. In later years, Lincoln said he was almost constantly handling the axe in Indiana. That image matters, not because it is picturesque, but because it reveals the split at the center of his character. Lincoln developed the body of a frontier laborer, but the mind of an observer. Even while doing punishing work, he was becoming something else entirely. And then there was the hunger for learning. Lincoln later said his education was acquired by littles and did not amount to even 1 full year. Yet he became a voracious reader. He read Parson Weems's Life of Washington, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, Robinson Crusoe, The Arabian Nights, and whatever else he could reach. The image of Lincoln carrying a book as well as his axe is one of the most important images in American history, because it captures the engine of his rise. He did not wait for a school to make him intelligent. He built his own education in fragments, from scraps, by force of appetite. That is the first key to making Lincoln compelling on screen. He was not merely poor, and he was not merely self-taught. He was internally driven in a way that borders on frightening. Many children endure hardship. Far fewer turn deprivation into discipline. Lincoln was already doing that. He was already teaching himself to think beyond his station. He was already preparing for a world he had not yet seen. The death that changed him. Then the story darkens. In October 1818, When Abraham was 9 years old, his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died of milk sickness after frontier illness swept through the area. According to the National Park Service account, she had gone to nurse sick neighbors and became a victim herself. For a boy already growing up in instability, this was not just family tragedy. It was a rupture at the emotional center of his world. Years later, Lincoln would say, "All that I am, or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." That sentence tells you everything. The future president carried her absence for the rest of his life. And then comes one of the most devastating details in Lincoln's early life. Thomas and young Abraham helped make Nancy's coffin from planks. This is not a symbolic embellishment. It is the brutal, physical reality of frontier life. The boy who would later write words that helped define a nation first encountered death in the most practical and intimate way possible. Not as abstraction, not as ceremony, as wood, nails, labor, and grief. A child helping construct the container for his mother's body. That image alone can carry an entire opening act, if you let it breathe. Loss did not make Lincoln theatrical. It made him deep. The sadness that later generations noticed in him did not appear from nowhere. It was being formed here, in the silence after work, in the emptiness of a house without a mother, in the knowledge that love can disappear, and life does not pause to help you understand it. His future empathy, his tenderness toward suffering, and even the grave power of his speeches all make more sense once you understand that Lincoln's greatness grew in the shadow of grief. The family's loneliness eventually led Thomas Lincoln back to Kentucky, where he married Sarah Bush Johnston. This second marriage changed Abraham's life. Sarah was remembered as kind, orderly, and deeply supportive. She helped unite the households and encourage Lincoln's reading instead of treating it as useless distraction. That support was not a small thing. In rough places, a young mind can be mocked into silence. Sarah Bush Johnston did the opposite. She gave Lincoln room to keep becoming himself. This is one of the most important emotional turns in the story. Lincoln is not formed only by hardship. He is also formed by rescue. A child can survive on endurance, but he develops through encouragement. Sarah Bush Johnston did not hand him a future, but she protected the inward life that would eventually create one. In a world dominated by blunt labor and narrow expectation, she validated the strange young man who wanted books as much as bread. By his late teens, Lincoln had become physically imposing. He stood 6'4" by the time he was 19, could wrestle with the best of them, and had a reputation for extraordinary strength. Neighbors remembered his power with the axe and his ability to drive it deeper than any man around. This contrast is crucial for a cinematic script. Lincoln was not a fragile scholar hiding from work. He was physically formidable. His intellect did not emerge in spite of frontier toughness. It emerged inside it. The first glimpses of the larger world. In 1828, Lincoln traveled on a flatboat to New Orleans, and according to the National Park Service account, he witnessed a slave auction there, an experience that greatly disturbed him. Whether viewers remember every date is irrelevant. What matters is the pattern. A young man from the frontier was beginning to see the machinery of America more clearly. Labor, commerce, hierarchy, and human beings treated as property. The wilderness had already taught him hardship. The wider world was now teaching him moral scale. He also discovered, in small ways, the power of money, law, and initiative. As a teenager, he ran passengers from shore to steamboats on the Ohio River, and once earned 2 silver $half in a single day, an astonishing sum for a poor boy. Later, when accused of violating ferry rights, He escaped penalty because he had not actually carried passengers all the way across the river. It is a small anecdote, but a revealing one. Lincoln was beginning to understand systems, where they began, where they ended, and how language and logic could alter outcomes. The future lawyer is already visible in the teenager. That is another reason Lincoln works so well in long-form storytelling. His rise is not sudden. It is incremental. First comes hardship, then observation, then moral awareness, then the discovery that words, rules, and reason can move the world almost as powerfully as muscle. Dead New Salem, where the myth begins. By 1830, the Lincolns had moved to Illinois. Not long after, Abraham began making his own way and landed in New Salem. This is where the story starts to accelerate. He worked as a store clerk, chopped wood, split rails, surveyed land, carried mail, and took on whatever job survival demanded. One source notes that he earned just $55 a year as postmaster, while supplementing his income with other labor and small legal tasks. Nothing about his life suggested inevitability. He was improvising a future from scattered opportunities. Yet New Salem also became the place where people first noticed the unusual combination inside him. He had physical force, but also humor. He had awkwardness, but also magnetism. He famously gained respect by wrestling the town bully, and he won people over not by aristocratic polish, but by intelligence, jokes, directness, and integrity. This is where the public Lincoln starts to form, not as a marble statesman, but as a man people trusted because he seemed unmanufactured. In 1832, he ran for the Illinois state legislature and lost. That could have been the end of the story. For most men, one public defeat in a hard life would have been enough evidence that ambition was a luxury. For Lincoln, defeat became instruction. During this same period, he served as a captain in the Black Hawk War, a role that added stature, even if it did not make him famous. He was learning two lessons at once: how men follow authority, and how easily hope can collapse in public. Both lessons would matter later. When he ran again in 1834, he won. Then he kept winning, serving 4 terms in the Illinois legislature. Notice the rhythm of Lincoln's ascent. It is never clean. It is effort, embarrassment, recovery, and then forward motion. He did not arrive in politics by destiny. He arrived by resilience. The making of the lawyer. While serving in politics, Lincoln studied law, largely on his own. He borrowed books, taught himself doctrine, and passed the bar in the mid-1830s before beginning practice in Springfield. Courtrooms became the next great forge of his mind. There, he sharpened the habits that would later define his statesmanship: patience, precision, storytelling, and the ability to strip confusion down to moral essentials. He learned how motives hide behind words, and how truth often has to be argued into visibility. The law also disciplined Lincoln's natural empathy. He was not merely emotional. He became analytical. He learned to weigh evidence, to understand interests, and to persuade without theatrics. His ambition, a law partner later said, was a little engine that knew no rest. That line should absolutely live in any serious Lincoln script, because it captures his internal combustion. He was no longer just trying to rise above poverty. He was trying to become equal to something larger inside himself. Mary Todd Lincoln and the Private Cost of Ambition. Lincoln's public growth unfolded alongside a complicated personal life. He married Mary Todd, and together they built a family with 4 sons: Robert, Edward, Willie, and Tad. Only Robert lived to adulthood. Eddie died young in Springfield. Willie later died in the White House. Tad would die years after his father. Any script that wants emotional force has to understand this. Lincoln did not merely govern grief. He lived inside it. The private and public versions of Lincoln were never separate for long. The man arguing cases, building a political career, and mastering language was also a husband and father moving through repeated personal loss. That is part of why his leadership later carried unusual tenderness. He was not performing sorrow for the country. He recognized it. He had already met it in his own home. Congress retreat and return. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. His term was brief, but revealing. He spoke against the Mexican-American War, a stand that damaged his popularity. This is one of the most useful tensions in his story. Lincoln was not naturally drawn to easy applause. Again and again, he showed a willingness to accept immediate political pain in exchange for consistency with principle. It did not always make him popular, but it made him durable. After Congress, he returned to Illinois and resumed law practice. To lesser storytellers, this looks like a lull. It is not. It is incubation. Lincoln's life repeatedly moves through these quiet stretches where the public spotlight dims, but the man himself becomes more dangerous, more informed, more disciplined, more capable of the role history has not yet offered him. The crisis of slavery. Then the nation changed, and Lincoln changed with it. The Kansas-Nebraska controversy and the expanding conflict over slavery pulled him back into politics with renewed force. After the collapse of the Whig Party, Lincoln aligned with the new Republican Party. He was no longer simply an Illinois lawyer with political experience. He was becoming the articulate conscience of a national crisis. In 1858, he delivered the House Divided speech. A house divided against itself cannot stand, he declared, warning that the government could not endure permanently half slave and half free. The power of this speech is not just in the phrase. It is in the inevitability. Lincoln was telling the country that the conflict could not be managed forever through evasion. The nation would become one thing or the other. That is why this speech feels prophetic even now. It is not merely rhetoric. It is diagnosis. 'Cause there the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The debates with Stephen A. Douglas in 1858 transformed Lincoln into a national figure. There were 7 debates across Illinois, structured with brutal endurance. One man would speak for an hour, the other for an hour and a half, and then the first would return for 30 minutes of rebuttal. This was democracy as public combat. Argument stretched to its physical limits before mass crowds. Lincoln lost the Senate race, but defeat once again carried him upward. The debates launched him into national prominence because Americans could now hear the shape of his mind. Clear, controlled, morally serious, and relentless without being hysterical. Douglas was a powerful opponent, but Lincoln emerged as something larger than a candidate. He became a possibility. This is one of the most cinematic turns in the entire story. The man loses the office and wins the future. That reversal is pure narrative gold. It proves that Lincoln's rise was never about smooth momentum. His defeats often revealed him more powerfully than his victories. When Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, the nation was already near fracture. Southern states began to secede in response to his election. He entered office not as the leader of a stable republic, but as the manager of impending collapse. In his first inaugural address, he warned that the issue of civil war rested in the hands of his dissatisfied fellow countrymen. while he remained bound by oath to preserve, protect, and defend the government. There is an extraordinary tension here that your script should lean into hard. Lincoln did not arrive in Washington with a solved ideology and total control. He arrived with a burden. The Union was coming apart before his presidency had even fully begun. He wanted to avoid war, but he refused to legitimize secession. He was now standing where all his earlier disciplines converged: moral clarity, legal reasoning, emotional steadiness, patience under pressure, and the ability to endure hatred without collapsing into rage. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter and forced its surrender, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. The Civil War had begun. The frontier boy who once fought trees, distance, and deprivation was now confronting the destruction of the nation itself. Civil War, the burden of command. The war transformed Lincoln from politician into war president. Every day brought reports of casualties, military failure, and political strain. He dealt with generals, rivals, critics, grieving families, and a public desperate for victory, but divided over what the war was truly for. The important thing is not simply that Lincoln led during war. It is that he had to keep redefining the meaning of that war while living inside its uncertainty. This is where Lincoln becomes dramatically compelling in a deeper way. He is not only courageous, he is adaptive. He grows under pressure. The presidency did not reveal a finished man. It completed the making of him. All the fragments of his early life, loss, labor, books, law, argument, patience, moral seriousness, were now being tested at national scale. White House Historical Association. Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that enslaved people in the rebellious states are, and henceforward shall be free. The proclamation did not end slavery everywhere at once. It did not apply to the loyal border states, and its promise of freedom depended in part on Union military victory. But this limitation should not weaken the moment in your script. It actually makes the moment more dramatic. Lincoln was acting within the constraints of war, law, and politics, while pushing the conflict onto unmistakable moral ground.